In programming, when you want to store a value, you store it in what's called a variable. One way to put a value in a variable is to use what's called an assignment statement. The general form of an assignment statement is you have the name of the variable on the left, and then the equal sign, and then an expression on the right. The order is important. It's always the variable on the left and the expression on the right. The equal sign is called the assignment operator. It does not mean equality. For example, in the command window, when you see the prompt, the greater than, you might type an assignment statement that says mynum, and then the assignment operator, and then the value of 6. So the way this works is that you always look at the expression on the right-hand side first, and you get a value of that expression. In this case, it's just 6. And then you're taking that value and storing it in the variable that you name on the left. So at the command prompt, you type this in, mynum, and then the equal sign and 6. And the way I'm going to say that out loud normally is mynum gets the value of 6. Because again, that's not the equal sign, that's the assignment operator. So you're putting the value of the expression into the variable. And when you do that, MATLAB comes back with showing you the variable name and what the value is, and then it gives you the prompt again. So once again, you can type another command or expression. So this assigns the result of the expression 6 to a variable called mynum. Now, if you know that you're putting a 6 in a variable called mynum and you don't want to see MATLAB coming back and showing that to you, you can put a semicolon after the assignment statement. And what that does is that suppresses the output. So it still puts the number in the variable, it just doesn't come back and show that to you. Now another thing you can do is you can just type an expression at the prompt. So if I just type 7 plus 4 at the prompt, then MATLAB will use what's called a default variable named ANS, A-N-S, and it'll reuse that every time you type in just an expression and not put it in an assignment statement. So this is going to store the result of the expression 7 plus 4, as MATLAB shows here, in the default variable ANS. Now think about what the word variable means. A variable is something that can change. So in programming, a variable is something that can change, or ahead of time you don't know what the value is going to be. So we can start by taking a variable, for example mynum, and we can initialize it. Initializing means putting its first value in it. So for example, at the prompt, and I'm not going to show the prompt here, but this would be typed at the prompt, I could say mynum gets the value of 5. So it puts the value 5 in the variable mynum. Then I could change the variable. Now remember that the way an assignment statement works is that you always look at the expression on the right first. You get a value out of that. And whatever the value of that expression is, you store it in the variable that's on the left. So in this case, mynum has the value of 5. So using the name of the variable means the value that's stored in it. So we have 5 plus 3 is 8, and we're storing that back in mynum. So mynum now has the value 8. Then we could increment it by 1, that means adding to it. So mynum now has the value 8. 8 plus 1 is 9. We're taking 9 and storing that in the variable mynum, so mynum now has the value 9. Then we could decrement, which means subtracting. So mynum is currently 9, minus 2 is 7. Store that result in mynum, so now it's going to have the value 7. So 7 would be the result of this sequence if we initialized and then changed by adding 3 and then incremented by 1 and then decremented by 2. So you can keep changing the value of a variable. Now there's some rules for names that you give for a variable. The name has to start with the letter of the alphabet. After that you can have letters, you can have digits, you can have the underscore character, but one thing you cannot have is a space. MATLAB is also case sensitive, which means that there's a difference between uppercase and lowercase letters. There is a length, and the built-in function nameLengthMax tells you what the limit is for the length of a variable name. It's really long though, you're not going to run into that. And variable names should be mnemonic, which means they should make some sense. If you're storing the radius of a circle in a variable, then you should call it something like radius and not x. So something that makes some sense. There are some commands that tell you things about variables, who and whos, which you can type at the command prompt. Whos will show you a little bit more information than who. And if you want to delete variables, you can use the clear command. Now every expression and variable has associated with it what's called a type, or in MATLAB, the word that's used is class. For example, there are numbers. Under numbers, there are really two categories. You have real numbers, numbers that have a decimal point in them, and there are two types for that built into MATLAB called single and double. Basically, double means double precision. You can store numbers that are twice as large in the type double as in the type single. And you have integers, which don't have any decimal places, and there are a bunch of different integer types. There are what are called signed integer types, int 8, int 16, int 32, int 64, for example. Signed means you're storing the sign of the number, whether it's a positive or a negative number, in other words. And there are unsigned integers in which you're not storing the sign, which means that they're always going to be positive. int 8, 16, 32, and 64. The numbers in these names are the number of bits that are used to store a value of that type. So you can store larger numbers in the type int 64, for example, than in the type int 8. There's also a type for characters and strings of characters called char, C-H-A-R. There's a type for the result of true-false expressions called logical. So for numbers, the default type is always going to be double. So if you don't specify otherwise, the default type for any number, variable, or expression is going to be double. The range of values that you can store in any of the integer types is found using built-in functions called int min and int max. You said int min in parentheses, and then you gave the name of the type int8 as a string, which means in single quotes. It would show you that it's negative 128 and int max is 127. So in other words, in the type int8, you can only store integers in the range from negative 128 to positive 127. One thing you can do is you can convert from one type to another using any of these names, single, double, int8, etc., as functions. And this is called casting or typecasting. So for example, let's say I start a variable num and I initialize it to have the value of 9. So by default, that's going to be a double variable. But then I'm going to take that variable and I'm going to pass it to the int32 function and create a new variable called num_i. So it's not going to change the value that's stored in it, that will be 9, but the type of this variable is going to be int32 rather than double. And you can see that with whose. It shows that the variable num is the type or the class double, and the variable num_i is the type or the class int32. So again, by taking this variable and passing it to the int32 function, it makes it the type int32, and that's again called casting or typecasting. You can use the class function to tell you what type any variable is.